Then why do so many people want to come here if we're so bad?
Because there are places where they can do good here. If we allow for that to happen and we create change.
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 So that means a changing America. You want a changing
America. Of course America has to change.
Right. And you'd like the changing America to be the dominant people would be people of color.
That's going to happen anyway.
But you want it to happen, do you not?
That's going to happen anyway.
Do you not want it to happen?
That's going to happen whether you or I want it or not.
And that's the bottom line on it, isn't it, Charles?
No, the bottom line
is
that you fear
I don't fear anything.
Your white privilege will no longer
want the
exist.
rule of law.
You
want a totally different country.
It's going to happen whether you like it or not, whether I want it or not. Look at New York City. The majority of the people in New York City are people of color. And that's why you have problems with immigration.
And that's
because of the browning of America.
That's why
you want to stay in control.
Now,
you want to stay in power.
A new report out by the government shows that by the year 2042, white Americans will no longer represent the majority of the population. That prediction is 8 years sooner than previously expected.
The Census Bureau believes that by 2042, white Americans will make up less than half of the U.S. population. But with so many mixed communities, diverse families, and changing mindsets, Hesbiver believes that by that time, ethnic lines will be blurred.
Will we reach even a point at which we will say these categories don't mean anything anymore?
Do I think white people will become a minority? When I say that, I include particularly the Hispanic population, and yet I'm not, they're really, as I understand it, that's not really a race. So when we talk technically race, that's wrong. It's just that Hispanic people are a protected class. Do I think white nationalists have a point in saying enough is enough when whites are now at 66%, when our founding fathers were at 100%? I guess I don't. I don't think they have a point. I don't appreciate those organizations. But to some extent, I guess I can appreciate maybe the people's sense of loss.
But in fact, white folks are starting to be a minority now.
You think white people like that?
Yeah, but seem like it's more Mexicans than white folks out here.
Just maybe someday it just means a completely blended group of people that nobody will be able to figure out what anybody is anymore.
Is that a good thing?
I think that's a great thing.
I think we are yellowing America and everybody's blending, and that, I think that's a good thing.
Ooh, that's a good question. I think we got enough here. And just imagine how America is going to be 15 years from now.
Oh, I can see the potential for a lot of racial tension between blacks and Latinos. You're here bleeding our social services, you're using our hospitals, you're using this without contributing anything to our society.
They can come over here and don't even have to speak English. You know what I'm saying? If we were in their country, we would have to adapt.
The people who want to come to America, the people who want to come to America from Mexico, my feeling is, by God, let them in,
Let them in?
Absolutely.
We've got some people saying that we've got to open up the door and allow more in.
No, we shouldn't.
People saying that we should close the door and build a wall.
Close the door and build a wall.
And what's so bad about it, these Mexicans have more of an attitude. They're more arrogant than what a white man is.
So you say that the Mexicans are more racist than the whites?
Yes, especially the ones with the big belt buckles and the reptile shoes.
The United States lets 250,000 immigrants come in every year. It's more than any country in the world.
Correct.
But you think that's not enough? We're not being generous enough?
Well, I think we got too many already.
We got too many?
Too many.
If you were the immigration czar, what would you do? If you could give one order, what would it be?
I would send them back.
All 20 million?
Yeah.
If you were the president, what would you do with the 20 million illegal aliens that are here?
Oh, Cinco dos Adios, they'd be gone. Oh, it would be no problem. Yeah, they'd be gone. Oh, no.
Now, if I said that, I know what would happen. I'd get called a racist.
When it comes to naming a baby, do you know which name is more popular right now in Great Britain? George or Mohammed? George? Wrong. No. It's Mohammed. You got it. Mohammed actually just overtook George on the list of the most popular names in the UK. With me now to talk about the deepening influence of Islam on life in Britain is Gerard Baker, U.S. editor of the Times of London. So, Jerry, what does this mean? Just more Muslims in Britain?
That's right. I mean, the number of Muslims is growing dramatically. Muslims tend to have larger families, many more children. Birth rates among the rest of the population are declining. It's even more dramatic in the rest of Europe. Muhammad is actually the single most popular name on birth certificates in Belgium, for example. Across Europe, this is a demographic phenomenon. More and more Muslims are having 5, 6, 7 children. Traditional Caucasian, if you like, Christians tend to be having 1 or in many cases no children at all. So we're on a steady path here towards a rapid increase in the proportion of the population that is Muslim.
Catastrophically falling birth rates, well below the replacement level.
It's entirely possible that the French will disappear. There will be no native-born French that come from the traditional French population.
What some call the demographic winter of Western society.
Yes, there are demographic shifts. Yes, women did decide in the past several decades to stop having as many children. They made a decision to control their fertility when contraceptives became more available. But the only reason to call that a crisis or a demographic winter is if you're overly focused on which babies are being born and whether they're the right religion and race.
I'll say, well, what would be so wrong? What would be so wrong if the Western world did become Muslim? And that, I think, is the self-neutering result of the multicultural mindset. You remember Mayor Nagin in New Orleans. When it turned out that a lot of the people who'd moved away didn't want to come back, he got all worried about that because he said New Orleans has always been, quote, a chocolate city, unquote. In other words, he thought that who lived there made a difference to what the city was. Why can't you make that point about Italians in Milan? Why can't you make that point about Swedes in Malmö? Why can't you make that point about Dutch people in Rotterdam? And I think that's what I find fascinating, that the leftist progressives say, well, what's the big deal if the whole world becomes Muslim? What would be wrong with that? Right. And I think what the response to that is, well, look, you know, okay, which currently Muslim city would you want to live in?
Exactly.
I like the Muslim world. I spent a lot of time in the Muslim world. I love Amman. I love Cairo. I love visiting them. But would I want to raise a family in Cairo? Would I want to try and do business in Cairo? Would I want to try and exercise my right to free speech even in Jordan, which is a supposedly moderate Muslim state? No. I'm very happy to visit them, but I'm very happy to come home to free, pluralist Western societies.
Yes, and I'm happy for that. I mean, I think multiculturalism is a cult of, by and large, a cult of ignorance. I'm astonished, you know, that if you label yourself a multiculturalist, it absolves you knowing anything about any other cultures. Try it. Ask a multiculturalist what the capital of Nepal is, or ask him about the principal exports of Malaysia or whatever. You won't. It absolves you from having to know anything about other cultures, and because of that, it actually, if everything is all the same, if everything is just as good and as bad as each other, who are we to say when we hear, for example, that Muslim polygamists in Ontario are claiming separate welfare checks for each of their wives? We sort of can't figure out, why is that wrong? Why is that wrong?
Migration's based on the false assumption that we're the products of our culture and that exposure to European culture will transform non-Europeans into Europeans in the second generation, if not the first. Distinct peoples are not the product of distinct cultures. Distinct cultures are the product of distinct peoples. Bring in the populations of the Third World into Europe and you'll be bringing the Third World into Europe, not temporarily, for all time. And that's what we've been doing for the last 6 decades. Thank you.
Genocide, the world's most heinous crime.
In Iraq, crimes comparable to the Holocaust. Saddam Hussein is being charged for the first time with genocide.
We promised to stop it.
Never again.
But it did happen. Again. And again. And again. Each time, there were a few who stood up to bear witness. A few who tried to stop the killings. But time after time, they were shunned, ignored, or told it was somebody else's problem. Each time they screamed bloody murder, the world turned away.
Oftentimes the word genocide is thrown around in international forums, and most of us think we know what defines genocide, but really we don't. The definition is much broader under international law. Article 2 of the Convention defines genocide as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and lastly, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Article 3, furthermore, defines the crimes that can be punished under this convention, and that is genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, or complicity in genocide. It goes on to talk about many things, but one thing becomes crystal clear. Anytime you deliberately inflict on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, it constitutes genocide. Now, most of us believe genocide happens as a war crime. Well, generally that's what it's prosecuted as. Saddam Hussein was prosecuted for war crimes, by and large, but it need not be a war crime. It can be a series of human rights violations. This is largely misunderstood. Lemkin, for instance, wrote after the law was first written, generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation, except when accomplished by mass killings of all members of the nations. It is intended to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of the essential foundations of the life of national groups, with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, of language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even lives of the individuals belonging to such groups. More often, it refers to a coordinated plan aimed at destruction of the essential foundations at the life of a national group, so that these groups wither and die like plants that have suffered a blight. The end may be accomplished by forced disintegration of political and social institutions, of the culture of the people, of their language, of their national feelings, of their religions. And that is very broad. Most listening to this would say that is extremely broad, and it can be when you start talking about a series of human rights violations. Most of us have heard this phrase in the West, race is just a social construct. Well, it isn't. It isn't. The word genocide comes from the word genotype. Genotype is interchangeable with race. For instance, the Indo-European genotype. It is very specific. It can be tested for again and again. You can't target that for extinction. If you do so, it's a hanging trial. I think it's common sense to most listeners. But what it comes down to is a series of human rights violation targeting someone for extinction. It's kind of entertaining hearing that this concept of race is a social construct, because under international law there is no such thing as a social construct. Yeah, Saddam Hussein doesn't show up at his trial and say the Kurds were just a social construct. All Iraqis were equal. The Kurds were just a social construct, and get off and get out of the tribunal. It doesn't really work that way. There are no social constructs under international law. If you don't believe me, go find Saddam Hussein and ask him.